I'm Sharif Abdul Quddus from Dropside News, dropsidenews.com. Today we're going to be speaking about a range of issues, but we're going to start with the most pressing issue right now, which is Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza. It's been over 2 months since the first phase of the Gaza ceasefire deal signed in January between Hamas and Israel came to an end, and a day after the first phase of that deal expired, Israel imposed a total blockade on Gaza, denying the entry of all food, fuel, medicine, and other humanitarian goods. And this is the longest blockade by far since the beginning of the war, and it's plunged Gaza into the worst humanitarian crisis of the 19-month war. This is essentially a policy of collective punishment and forced starvation on Gaza's 2 million residents. More than 65,000 children have been hospitalized with severe malnutrition, and there are real fears that thousands of children are literally going to starve to death or die of related illnesses. And this total blockade is coming as Israel continues a relentless scorched earth bombing campaign that it restarted on March 18th. More than 2,500 Palestinians, mostly women and children, have been killed since then. This is the rate roughly of killing about 50 Palestinians a day, civilians, most of them. And the death toll is probably much higher. These are just the numbers that have of bodies that have passed through public hospitals that the Ministry of Health is able to confirm. And we're seeing multiple airstrikes every day. Across the Gaza Strip, from Rafah to Beit Hanun. They're bombing displacement camps, bombing cafes, bombing hospitals, bombing charity kitchens, bombing civilian gatherings, bombing in areas of so-called humanitarian zones. They bombed over 30 bulldozers and other pieces of heavy machinery that were used to clear rubble and rescue people after airstrikes. So you have rescue crews trying to, in vain, save people by digging them out with their hands. I just want to give you a very quick example of, for example, just a few hours in Gaza. I'll read you yesterday's update summary from Dropside social media team, who really do incredible work in trying to keep abreast of developments, not just in Gaza, but around the world. It's really one of the best wire news feeds you can get right now. So this is yesterday's roundup, where at least 63 Palestinians were killed in Gaza. 8 to 9 a.m., 4 people killed in the Attar family home in Beit Lahia. 10 to 11 a.m., shelling in eastern Tufah, demolitions reported, 2 killed west of Khan Yunis. 12 to 1 p.m., a strike on a cafeteria in Sheikh Radwan, 2 killed and 6 injured in Gaza City. A child killed in a drone strike in northern Gaza. Another person died from wounds in Khan Yunis. 1 to 2 p.m., 5 killed, including 2 children, in a strike on a family home east of Khan Yunis. A drone strike east of Gaza City, 1 killed in northeastern Khan Yunis. 3 to 4 p.m., a child killed in Shuja'iyya, which is in Gaza City. A woman killed in Dir al-Balah, 2 killed in Beit Hanun. 4 to 6 p.m., 7 killed in Gaza City and Khan Yunis. I can keep going. This goes up to 9 p.m., but this is just to give you a sense of the scale of the carnage that Israel is conducting in Gaza. During this entire period that we're talking about, regional mediators, Qatar and Egypt, have failed to convince Israel to return to the original 3-phase framework deal, which stipulated an eventual complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza and the declaration of a permanent ceasefire. And instead, Israel's issued a series of new demands, and among these are the total demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, the exiling of Hamas's leaders, and the removal of Hamas as the governing authority in Gaza. And yesterday, we saw Israel approve plans for the capture of the entire Gaza Strip and to remain entrenched there indefinitely. The plan also calls for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to be forcibly displaced yet again to the south, squeezing them onto even less land. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that the Palestinian population will, quote, will be moved for its own protection. The head of the military said they're calling up tens of thousands of reserve soldiers. already 70% of Gaza, 70% has been designated a no-go zone or is under active displacement orders. And over the past 7 weeks, we've already seen 400 or upwards of 420,000 Palestinians be displaced yet again. And just yesterday also, the Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, said that Israel is now in a position to declare victory over Gaza, quote, within months, and that Gaza will soon be completely destroyed and its population will be forced into a small part of the south. And from there, they will, quote, leave in large numbers to third countries. And all of these threats, these increasing threats on Gaza seem to be timed to coincide with President Donald Trump's trip to the region in a little over a week, where he'll visit Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. So this is where things stand on the ground. To talk about this, I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Jeremy Scahill and Murtaza Hussain. Jeremy, we want to start with you. You had the chance to travel and meet with several leaders of Hamas and other Palestinian factions. This is not something that is easy to do or get access to. And yesterday we published on Dropsite both a print article and a full audio podcast and transcript of your in-depth interview with Osama Hamdan, one of the most prominent voices representing Hamas over the past 19 months. I encourage everyone to read and listen to that interview, and we'll be publishing more of your reporting based on your conversations with other figures of the Palestinian resistance in the coming days. But Jeremy, can you start off by explaining, firstly, why you thought it was important to have this wide-ranging interview with Osama Hamdan, explain who he is, and why you thought it was important to speak with him right now?
This has been true for many decades, but we've seen it in an acute way over the past 19 months. And that is that Palestinians, particularly Palestinians who are leaders of resistance movements, are almost never allowed the space to explain the historical context in which they operate, the principles on which they operate, the political strategy that they are embracing. It's a cartoonish, largely Israeli-shaped narrative that is deployed to describe who Hamas is, who Palestinian Islamic Jihad is, what Palestinian resistance is about. Often it's portrayed as being akin to ISIS or Al-Qaeda. But the reality is that it is journalistic malpractice not to try to understand the political motivations of people who are engaged in a war against or an uprising against occupation, apartheid, colonialism. Always the people who are on the other end of the barrel of the gun of the powerful are demonized. And always there is a label of terrorist applied to those who are rising up against established power, particularly if that established power is backed by the United States and Western imperial interests. And certainly that's true of the Palestinians. But I've watched over the course of these almost 19 months of Israel's genocidal war, the way that the public is provided information about Hamas's perspective or Islamic Jihad's perspective, or the perspective of any number of Palestinian factions, parties, resistance groups, and felt that it is our duty as journalists to actually speak with those people and not just look for a soundbite or not just constantly insist on relitigating the events of October 7th or responding to assertions made by Israel or the United States, but to actually understand the motivation. And it's not just journalistic malpractice not to do this. It is a total disservice to the public understanding of not just the events of the past 19 months, but the events of the past 76 years in the case of Palestine. So when we launched Dropsite last summer, the first articles that we did were attempting to examine the political perspective of Hamas, the historical context in which October 7th happened. That was how this news organization launched. And as we've watched Israel blow up this ceasefire deal, which was brokered by Qatar, Egypt, and guaranteed by the United States, that was signed on January 17th, we knew from the beginning, because DropSite was covering this very closely, that Netanyahu had claimed that this was going to be a one-phase deal, even though the deal was 3 42-day phases. After the first 42-day phase, the second phase would kick in, and it envisioned a complete Israeli withdrawal of forces from Gaza, technical discussions on the implementation of a long-term ceasefire that would pave the way to a third phase, which was a multi-year reconstruction project. And during that second phase, there was supposed to be the release of all Israeli captives that were held in Gaza, and several thousand Palestinians snatched or held by Israel, many of them children, women, people who have not been actually convicted of any crimes, that they were also supposed to be released. But what Israel did from the very beginning was Netanyahu said, well, I have a side agreement with both the outgoing Biden administration and incoming Trump administration, that if we decide that resuming the war is in our interest, we can do so. So we knew that this was quite likely. So March 1st came and went. That was the end of the ceasefire deal, phase one. And the Israelis had not sent a serious negotiating team to talk about implementing phase two. On March 2nd, they impose a full spectrum blockade on Gaza with the stated purpose of trying to strangle and starve the Palestinians either into rising up against Hamas or Hamas into capitulating. And then on March 18th, they resumed full-scale bombing. I should remind you, I know you're aware of this, that the Israelis repeatedly violated that ceasefire agreement, even the agreement they signed, by continuing to kill more than 100 Palestinians, by not allowing in the agreed upon aid, etc. But the Palestinians didn't respond to that in any sort of aggressive way or militaristic way, but they objected to it. But they continued to say, we'll respect the three-phase deal. So once Israel blew that up, you had a narrative start to form that this was Hamas's fault and that Hamas is being unreasonable. And so what happened is that Israel started telling Egypt and Qatar, there are new rules now to the game. That three-phase deal that we signed in January, that's done. We have new red lines. And among those red lines were two very significant demands that Israel said were non-negotiable. One was the total disarmament of Hamas, and the other was that Hamas needed to surrender to Israel and to leave Gaza, its officials to leave Gaza, etc. So we start looking at these proposals and recognize that what Israel is doing is what it's done not just throughout the Gaza war, but for many, many years prior to that in previous agreements with Palestinians, is that they make an agreement, the Palestinians abide by it overwhelmingly, and then the Israelis decide, well, actually, we want to push further than what we agreed to, and we want to actually try to force the Palestinians to bend the knee in front of our colonialist ethno-state, under threat of full resumption of an intense war of annihilation. Now, because the narrative, first of all, we have two factors. One is that the coverage of Gaza has just plummeted across Western media and even in some Arabic language media. So that you have that dynamic. But then the other is the Israeli narrative that is being promoted also by the Trump administration increasingly started to sort of take hold. And people were saying, media reports were saying, Hamas has rejected a peace offering. Hamas has rejected a deal. The political context to this is that the Israelis not only rejected the deal, have sought to blow it up entirely and have resumed the genocide, killing more than 2,400 Palestinians, most of them women and children, including burning them alive as they sleep in tents that they have set up after being forcibly displaced multiple times over. So witnessing that context, witnessing the propaganda, witnessing the manufacturing of consent for a continuation of the war of annihilation, I felt that it was important to try to not just ask Hamas for comments. I do that all the time, and we report that at DropSite, but to really sit down and speak with officials from Hamas, because they have been designated by the Palestinian resistance groups as the chief negotiators for any deal that's going to be made. You know, people think, well, Hamas is in charge of everything. It's true. Hamas is the largest Palestinian armed resistance faction that is operating in the Gaza theater. But Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which has a quite significant presence as well in the West Bank, has been a major part of these negotiations. So there is a process by which Hamas was designated as the entity to do these negotiations. So speaking to Hamas is journalistically responsible in order to understand what are the actual facts as they exist. So I went to the region and met with, for many, many hours, I met with a whole series of Hamas officials on a range of subjects. We discussed the most recent terms that were put in front of Hamas. And just to share a bit of detail about this, Sharif, what I was told, and there had been some reporting about this, but there were denials and allegations, etc., about the role of Egypt. What I was told is that the Egyptians and the Qataris are the two main regional mediators, although you have some involvement of the Emiratis and the Turks on the kind of periphery of this, and of course you have the United States, but that the Egyptians have increasingly been putting pressure on Hamas to offer concessions that fall far outside of the original January framework that Hamas agreed to. And that Hamas was disturbed when Egypt started presenting this demand from Israel of disarmament. Now, they didn't say this was an Egyptian demand or that the Egyptians were saying, you must accept this. But Hamas said that they felt it was off, that Egypt seemed to be relaying this in a kind of direct way that was not appropriate for a mediator. And what's interesting about that, I asked, what's the difference between Egypt and Qatar in this dynamic? And it was quite interesting. We don't often examine these dynamics, but what the position or the perspective of Hamas is that Egypt, because it borders Gaza and because it is so close to Israel, has a different set of interests geopolitically than Qatar. So Egypt, as one Hamas official said, the deep state of Egypt has an interest in Hamas continuing to exist in Gaza, but in a dramatically weakened form, so that it can pose some form of a threat to keep the tensions high with Israel and keep Egypt relevant in the equation beyond the obvious, but as a strategic, necessary entity that will have to constantly deal with the aftershocks of what Israel does in Gaza. But also that Egypt has its own history with the Muslim Brotherhood. The last time there were true democratic elections in Egypt, Mohammed Morsi was democratically elected. Mohammed Morsi comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood movement. It's not directly the Muslim Brotherhood in this, in the Egyptian context, but they come from the same political origin. And so you have a complicated game that the dictator of Egypt, Sisi, is playing, the second largest recipient of US military aid, second only to Israel. So Egypt's perspective on this is not simply, we want to find a way to end the genocide. Egypt has its own geopolitical interests that are not actually about the fate of the Palestinian people for the sake of saving them or defending their right to self-determination. So when Egypt is perceived by Hamas to kind of, they didn't say doing Israel's bidding, but seemed to be pushing Hamas to drop the legitimacy of the original ceasefire deal, Hamas basically started to say, you know what, we're going to draw a line in the sand on this. And we're no longer going to engage in any agreement. And they said this to me on the record and on background. There will be no more short-term truces that do not include an irrevocable path to an end of the Israeli occupation of Gaza, the full withdrawal of Israeli forces, and an end to the genocide. Now, Hamas is saying our preference is we go back to the January framework and we resume the second phase. During that second phase, the Israelis were supposed to be completely withdrawing and the captives were going to be exchanged. Or an alternative arrangement, perhaps with some concessions here and there, that also leads to the same path of Israeli withdrawal, an end to the genocide, a full exchange of captives. So Hamas is saying, we're done. You asked about the recent, we have the recent Operation, Gideon's Chariot that has been leaked in the Israeli media, which is this plan to conquer and hold all of these sections throughout Gaza, and then forcing Palestinians into an increasingly small area in the south, and that Israel would remain there indefinitely. Hamas is saying, we are not going to lay down our weapons or agree to any disarmament in any form until there's a path to a Palestinian state. I asked them about media reports that Hamas was contemplating temporarily storing its weapons under some kind of neutral third party or handing them over as a gesture of kind of good faith. And they said, this is a complete concoction in the media. This has never even been formally raised with Hamas. It just goes to show you how inaccurate and wild some of the reporting is. They're saying this has never been raised formally. And is Israel going to store its weapons during this period? That's what Hamas is saying. Who's going to go to Israel and say, you have to put your weapons up? Because history, according to Hamas, has shown that when the Palestinians do surrender their weapons, it's followed by more Israeli massacres. And we are now in the most intense phase of a 76-year Nakba, the intention of which is to annihilate the Palestinian people from their land. So their perspective is, we're done with these games. We're done, from their perspective, of trying to be reasonable and constantly being asked to make concessions, because we're getting to a point where those concessions call into question the very existence of the Palestinian people in Gaza.
Yeah, it's very interesting, especially when you're talking about Egypt. What I found, some of his comments, some of the most interesting comments he gave, that he said he was astonished that Egypt was bringing this proposal to them as a mediator, because Egypt should have known that Hamas would reject this, would reject a call for complete demilitarization, essentially a call to surrender. And they should have told the Israelis that. And he gave a very interesting example and said, okay, if Hamas told Egypt to propose to the Israelis that Netanyahu needs to step down and they need to hand over Tel Aviv to the Palestinians, would Egypt even consider this proposal? Of course not. They would tell Hamas, no, that's ridiculous. You can't do that. But so Egypt does appear to be pressuring Hamas to kind of accept these new terms. And I can say that for many years, Egypt's essentially been a very strong ally to Israel. They helped to enforce the blockade on Gaza since 2006. They eventually destroyed the tunnels that provided a lifeline to Gaza. They coordinated with Israel on security. They allow Israeli drones and helicopters and warplanes to carry out covert air campaigns in Sinai. And Egypt's treatment of Palestinians coming from Gaza is notorious for its indignity. And most recently, up until they had control of the Philadelphia corridor, up until last year when Israel invaded Rafah in May, just over a year ago, Palestinians were able to leave Gaza through Rafah with security clearance. In order to get that security clearance, Egyptian intelligence was part of this extortion network that essentially was charging Palestinians thousands of dollars per person in order to leave Gaza. And so, but at the same time, they do have this very deep connection to Gaza. Egypt also administered Gaza up until 1967. Egyptian intelligence does have very strong ties to Hamas, real connections. They helped broker the ceasefire in 2021 and were very effective in doing that. And they want to have a stake in the game going forward. So yeah, I found his comments extremely telling in that. And also, you spoke to him about the role of the Biden administration and the Democrats, and he basically reiterated that the January ceasefire deal would not have happened if Kamala Harris had won the elections. But also, Osama Hamdan was one of the Hamas officials who spoke directly with the Trump administration. One of the Hamas officials was in direct talks with Adam Boehler. Can you explain who Adam Boehler is and what Osama Hamdan said about his meeting with him?
I mean, first, just one bit of background about Osama Hamdan. He's a chemist by training, and this is one thing I just want to share with people, because you don't often think about it. When you talk to many of these resistance leaders, so many of them are doctors or scientists or scholars. I mean, Gaza has one of the highest rates of higher degrees of education of any population in the world, and many of them were educated in the West. For instance, Bassem Naim, another senior Hamas official, is a medical doctor who studied medicine in Germany. Abu Marzouk studied and got higher degrees in the United States. Osama Hamdan, a highly educated man, and he joined Hamas in 1992, a few years after its founding, and has served in a number of key capacities for the movement. He was the head of its operations in Tehran, in Iran, in Lebanon. He was the head of its international relations department and was one of the top advisors to Ismail Haniyeh, who was assassinated by Israel last summer in Tehran when he went to attend the inauguration of the new Iranian president. And remember that Ismail Haniyeh won the elections in Palestine in 2006, not just in Gaza, but in all Palestinian territories. Ismail Haniyeh was supposed to be the prime minister of all of Palestine, and then you had the civil war break out between Mahmoud Abbas's forces from Fatah and Hamas, and that essentially split Palestine into the occupied West Bank and Gaza. And so, Hamas has been in charge of Gaza since that period. But I just want to remind people that they actually won the full democratic elections that the Carter Center and others said were free and fair elections. So when we're talking about the figures here that are shaping the political perspective of Hamas, it's cartoonish how they're portrayed. You can have your own, whatever opinion you want about what their policies are, what their perspectives are, but at least base it on a factual assessment, on real information, and not just what feels good to you to say about them because, oh my God, scary Hamas. So I say all of this because Osama Hamdan and Bassem Naim, who is a senior member of the political bureau of Hamas, were the point people in meeting with Adam Boehler. So they have a series of discussions with Adam Boehler, who was President Trump's special envoy on hostages. Adam Boehler is also a college roommate of Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law, and a close friend of the Trump family. So Boehler goes over, technically because his mandate is to speak to anyone, anywhere about American captives, and there is at least one living U.S. citizen, or believed to have been living at least until recently, Idan Alexander, being held in Gaza. There are several other people with American citizenship that were held. Some have been released in exchange deals. Others have been killed since the October 7th war began. So the official reason that they were meeting with Adam Boehler was to discuss American captives held in Gaza. But what Hamas officials told me was that these were much broader discussions that took place, and that Boehler actually was expressing great interest, not just in understanding Hamas's perspective on the events of October 7th and since then, but also in understanding the political history of Hamas, the political history of the Palestinians, and how they see that history. They said that it was a very friendly and diplomatic conversation. And when Adam Boehler then goes on American television after word of these direct talks became public, and on Israeli television, he starts saying things like, that they were that essentially that they're normal people to talk to, that they engage in diplomatic conversation, and he pushed back against, Ron Dermer, Netanyahu's political hitman, who's in charge of negotiations now for Israel, saying, Ron Dermer, Israel doesn't set the policy of the United States, and we can talk to whomever we want to speak with. Well, Boehler then is subjected to a big smear campaign for having the audacity to imply anything other than Hamas were monsters, with horns growing out of their heads. And so what was going to happen, though, when that took place, is that the Boehler meetings, I was told, were meant to lead to direct talks with Steve Witkoff, who is Donald Trump's main envoy negotiating any deal that's going to happen in Gaza. And Hamas believes that the Israeli campaign against Adam Boehler was actually aimed at ensuring that Steve Witkoff was not going to engage in direct talks with Hamas. And they also said this is one of the reasons why they assassinate people like Ismail Haniyeh or others, because they don't want an elected Palestinian, for instance, with legitimacy to be able to speak directly to the Americans. So that's what Hamas is saying. But their belief was that Adam Boehler understood it. He understood it to the point where Adam Boehler more or less accurately described what is known in Arabic as a hudna proposal from Hamas. He goes on Israeli and American television and he says, what Hamas is proposing is a multi-year, all-for-all deal with Israel, where all Israeli captives are going to be released and where large numbers of Palestinian prisoners are going to be released and where we're not going to have an active war anymore. This was an American official engaging in direct talks with Hamas, who then goes on television, not just in the United States, but also in Israel, and more or less accurately describes what is Hamas's major idea about how to resolve the conflict with Israel that it's been proposing since the early 1990s, when Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, first started discussing a hudna while in an Israeli prison. Then Boehler gets destroyed in the press. The Witkoff meeting is off. The Israelis resume the genocidal scorched earth bombing campaign. And now you see Trump parroting. There was a moment where Trump was sort of not so inaccurate in kind of how he talked about things regarding Gaza. But now Trump is like, he's just becoming a conveyor belt for the Israeli narrative in many, many ways. And, so from the perspective of Hamas, I think it was very telling for them. And they feel that the world should understand this, that when diplomats are allowed to directly speak with them, and it's not through an Israeli-controlled lens or an Israeli-controlled microphone that could be yanked away, and they're able to actually explain their perspective about the Palestinian cause of liberation, what they think about a two-state solution, what they think it would be necessary to have actual meaningful stability and peace in the region, that gets very dangerous for Israel.
Yeah, Jeremy, and for anyone listening and watching this, I really encourage them to go and listen to the interview or read the text as well, too, because I think in addition to what it offers about the present political situation, it's really a historical document, because there's been a policy of the Israeli government for many, many decades, going back to the PLO in the 70s, to try to assassinate Palestinian figures, to stop them from talking to the Americans directly, and to always make sure they're an interlocutor with everything that's portrayed of any Palestinian resistance group, Hamas or its predecessors, any ideology and so forth. So, Jeremy, what you did actually by acting as the intermediary, cutting out the intermediary and letting them speak for themselves, people can judge what they want. It's extremely, extremely important and consequential. So it's very, very resonant for that reason. I want to ask you, in the interview, Osama Hamdan, you talked to him about what they see as a political solution to the conflict, and they actually expressed that as well too. Can you speak a bit about what they see as an end state for this conflict? And the reason I ask also is because the Israelis are being very forthright, uncharacteristically, I think, frank about what they see as end state. Today, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said that they see the destruction of Gaza and the forcible immigration of the population out of the territory as the goal of the current Gideon's Chariot military operation, pretty much explicitly saying they have a genocidal and ethnic cleansing goal for how to end the conflict. What did Hamas say? What do they see as an end state? And how do they express a pathway of how to achieve that?
It's a really important question that you're raising, Maz. And I mean, first, let's back up. People that are supporting Israel's genocidal war are very fond of saying, "Oh, Hamas's position is that they want to wipe Israel off the map and that they're in a war against Jews because they're Jews." And there are documents and statements from the past of Hamas that they will, bring up and say, "Aha, this is proof." But since 2017, Hamas has an official charter that lays out that Hamas, first of all, Hamas's official position is that it is not at war against the Jewish people, that it has nothing but respect for the Jewish religion, that it recognizes it as a major world faith, and that the problem is with a Zionist, colonialist war of annihilation and occupation against the Palestinian people. I had months ago one of the most senior officials in Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Dr. Mohammed al-Hindi, say to me that if Benjamin Netanyahu spoke from atop the highest mosque in all of Palestine and announced that he had reverted to Islam, but he was continuing with his political plan toward the Palestinians, it wouldn't change a thing. I had Osama Hamdan saying that if a Muslim was engaged in the same conduct as Israel, I would fight him too. But most important, and this is what you're getting at, I asked Osama Hamdan about the prospects for what is often called in the West a two-state solution. And I expected him to say, it's done, it's over. And the Israelis are saying that. You can go and look in the Israeli media today. You have prominent Israeli political figures like Benny Gantz, the so-called opposition, saying anyone who talks about a future Palestinian state is delusional. Well, Osama Hamdan didn't say that. He pointed out the ways in which Israel has created conditions that make it extraordinarily difficult to imagine a Palestinian state and an Israeli state. But he said that he still hasn't given up hope on it. And he said that Hamas's official position is that if there was an internationally brokered and guaranteed arrangement whereby the Palestinians could establish their state along the borders of pre-June 4th, 1967, before the 1967 war, with East Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state, and with international guarantees that the Palestinian state would be given all rights as other states on earth, that Hamas will not stand in the way of it. And I don't think that this is just rhetoric. I think that, again, highly educated, intelligent people immersed in the Palestinian liberation struggle for their whole life, I think they're recognizing that they have to figure out what is a viable path. And their analysis says that it is Israel that has totally obliterated that. I had another Palestinian resistance leader say to me, okay, let's have a two-state solution. Show me the other states' borders. Look at what's happening in the West Bank. Who's going to deal with the illegal settlements that have been expanded and expanded and expanded? Netanyahu's not just, and Israel's not just waging a war of annihilation against the Palestinians in Gaza, they're waging a war of extermination against Palestinian existence in the occupied West Bank. So it's almost, you're asking the victim, who is manufacturing his own weapons in underground factories to be the agenda setter for regional peace, when you have an arsonist running around, bombing multiple countries, possessing nuclear weapons, threatening regime change across the region, violating the sovereignty of Lebanon, of Syria, of Yemen, of Iran, of the Palestinians. The onus should be on Israel to say, what is your long-term solution? Well, we know what Netanyahu has said the long-term solution is. The long-term solution, the final solution, is that the Palestinians need to either bend the knee and live essentially as indentured servants under a religious supremacist ethno-state, or they need to be forced off their land, or they need to be dead. So when Adam Boehler, or when I'm not comparing myself to Adam Boehler, but I'm just saying when people that are outside of the sort of arena of this talk to people from Hamas and you listen to them, you can agree or disagree, you can debate, but they actually do have a vision. They do have a plan. And that vision and that plan bears almost no resemblance to the way that they are reported on in Western media or characterized by Western politicians. They believe that Palestinian armed resistance will become irrelevant when Palestine is a state with its own armed forces capable of defending its territorial integrity, which is the right of any state in the world. And so on the issue of are we going to surrender our weapons, the answer is yes. They are saying they will surrender their weapons. The day that Palestine is given its right to have an armed force capable of defending itself from an extremely brutal and violent enemy that has spent 76 years trying to erase the Palestinian people off of planet Earth.
Yeah, I found his comment on the two-state solution quite interesting because actually most groups and most intellectuals, most activists, and the movement, the pro-Palestine movement, has moved on from that and essentially see any discussion about a two-state solution in realistic terms as a promulgation of apartheid. There is no realistic scenario where the two-state solution, or has ever been really, where Palestinians have a proper state with real sovereignty, that Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship will be treated as equal citizens. But it is true. Can
I clarify one thing?
Yeah.
Sharif, just to make sure that I'm relaying this accurately. My sense is that that Hamas And most Palestinians believe in a one-state solution. They believe that there is an apartheid state that has created one set of rules for Jewish Israelis and another set of rules for the Arabs and Muslims that live on that territory. And the position, I think, is we're not telling Jewish people that they need to leave. We're not trying to create a religious supremacist ethno-state. We want democracy. We want democracy from the river to the sea. That's the position. But what I thought Hamdan was saying was, we also recognize that there are other players in this that, for their own reasons, are obsessed with this notion of we have to sing kumbaya and have a two-state solution. So what Hamas's position is if that becomes the will of the Palestinian people, we will not stand in the way of it. I'm just, he's not out there rallying for let's go back to Oslo. He's saying,
no, of course, I know that.
We're not obstructionists.
But yes, and they did re-amend their charter in 2017 to accept willingly, as Fatah and other groups have, a really historic concession of giving up over 70% of historic Palestine willingly to accept this two-state solution as a way, as a possible path. But yeah, you're absolutely right that, I think the movement has largely moved beyond that. I wanted to ask you, Jeremy, also, because we've spoken about journalists, and you spoke with both people in Hamas and the Islamic Jihad about journalists that we have been covering. And of course, Israel's campaign in Gaza, part of the genocidal assault has been the targeting and killing of journalists. Over 200 of them have been killed in Gaza alone. A rate of killing of journalists that is unheard of in generations. One of our contributors in Gaza right now, Rasha Abu Jalal, tells me that Israel has targeted journalists to such a degree that regular people in Gaza are afraid to live close to journalists in the same building or in the same tent or in a tent nearby, that they ask journalists to move because they're afraid of being bombed next to them. That's what it's come to. And our colleague, Hossam Shabet, a 24-year-old journalist who is a reporter also for Al Jazeera Mubashir and a contributor to Dropside News, who was assassinated on March 24th. Hossam, as many people know, was one of the few reporters who remained in the north for the entirety of the genocide. And in October, he was labeled a terrorist and a militant, along with 5 other journalists for Al Jazeera Mubashir, by the Israeli military. They said that they either belonged to the Qassam brigades or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that they were militants essentially. And then on March 24th, the Israeli military, and so they put these 6 journalists on a hit list. And on March 24th, they bombed Hossam in Beit Lahia. They blew his legs off his body, and they killed him. And they repeated after this that he was a militant, that he was a member of the Qassam brigades. And they wrote, quote, "Don't let the press vest fool you." So Jeremy, you asked Osama Hamdan about Hossam Shabet. Tell us what he told you. And also, I'll briefly say about Ali Sammoudi, who's a journalist based in Jenin in the West Bank, a veteran journalist of many decades in Jenin, who was called the living martyr because he had been shelled, he had been shot, he had been detained, but he managed to continue reporting from Jenin. He was next to Shireen Abu Akleh when Israeli snipers opened fire on them. He was shot himself in the shoulder and very badly wounded. Last week, and I'll say I interviewed him in Jenin, in his house. He's the most kind, generous journalist I have met. His granddaughter was playing with him. He called her his best friend. And then the next day, the Israelis raided Jenin. He was out there in the street reporting live. Really a veteran and an incredible journalist. Last week, the Israeli military raided his home, beat him up so badly that he was hospitalized, and threw him into detention. There's reporting in Haaretz that, as opposed to many other journalists, including Mujahid al-Saadi, who reported for us from Jenin in September, who's been in prison in since September in administrative detention, where you can be held without charge or trial. Ali Samoudi is being put on trial in a hearing today on charges reportedly of having a connection to Palestinian Islamic Jihad and to funding terrorism. That's in quotes. So you also spoke about him with Muhammad al-Hindi of Islamic Jihad. So can you just talk about both those cases and what you were told?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Sharif. First of all, when the Israeli government put out the hit list on our journalistic colleagues, these 6 reporters that you're referencing, including Hossam Shabbat, and also someone that I consider a journalistic hero, Anas al-Sharif, who is, every time I watch him, I feel such a sense of shame that Western journalism has failed to defend, support, promote the work of our Palestinian colleagues, not to mention to stand ferociously against the targeted assassination campaign and mass murder campaign that's been unleashed against these brave journalists and oftentimes their family members as well. But when that happened, I started asking, because the Israelis also released a document that they claimed showed ID numbers and which units they were in, and they said that, if I recall correctly, that Hossam Shabbat was a sniper in the Beit Hanun battalion of the Al-Qassam brigades. So I was asking Hamas about this, and nobody was really ever, responding. I was saying, can you see if there's any truth to this whatsoever? So I've been working on this for months and months, and I every once in a while would ask about it. Not because I believed there was any truth to it. I never thought there was any truth to it, but because I felt like it was the responsible thing to do journalistically. And I also was wondering, were these documents fabricated? So I've been poking around this for a while, before Hossam was killed even. And, since he was killed, I then re-upped that. And I started going back to various Hamas officials and saying, can you give me comment on this? And it just wasn't happening. And so finally, when I then met with these Hamas officials, I didn't just meet with 2 Hamas officials, I met with a whole series of Hamas officials. They actually told me Qassam Brigades did an audit of this question, which is surreal to imagine, and investigated it and spoke to people, not just in Beit Hanun, but in other areas. And we can say, this is what Hamas said, we can say with not a single shred of doubt that Hossam Shabbat was not a member of Hamas and was most certainly not a member of the Qassam Brigades and was most certainly not a sniper in the Beit Hanun battalion. And then I said, well, what about the documents that Israel put up? And Osama Hamdan said, totally fabricated documents. I said, so you're saying clearly on the record to me that those are fabricated documents that Israel released? He said, absolutely fake documents. On the issue of, but none of that shocked me. And it feels even dirty to ask those questions. But you know what? That's the reality we live in right now. You know that they're lying. The Palestinians are constantly being forced to prove negatives to the world. That's the reality of what it means to be not a Palestinian journalist, to be a Palestinian. You have to somehow spend every day proving your humanity, that you're a living human being to the world. And so in the case of Hossam Shabbat, Sharif, you spoke with him, I talked to him. Hossam was a brave, but also gentle, poetic, remarkable person. He wanted to be a writer. When we would get his writings in Arabic, it was, you would share it and say, he wrote lyrically. I remember the emotion that you expressed when he was assassinated, but that's the story of Palestinians, that they're constantly having to prove negatives, prove things that they're accused of that are, false. And so I did ask those questions because I wanted to get on the record from the entity that he was accused of being a member of. And had he been a Qassam member, Qassam probably would have put out a martyr bio for him. So that's the story on the Hossam allegations that Hamas now says are totally false and based on fabricated documents. Regarding Ali Samoudi, I happened to be with Mohammed al-Hindi, who is the number 2 leader of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the second biggest armed resistance faction fighting in Gaza right now. And so we were sitting together when another person said, they've taken Ali Samoudi. And Mohammed al-Hindi said, the journalist? And he said, yeah. And then you texted me, Sharif, and you said they're accusing him of being involved with some financial business involving Islamic Jihad. Well, I'm sitting there with the second highest ranking member of Islamic Jihad. And I'll just tell you this at a human level. When I said that, he thought maybe that it was being mistranslated. He said, Ali Samoudi, he's like, of course I know who he is. He's a famous Palestinian journalist. He said, he has nothing to do with Islamic Jihad. Why would we ever use someone like him for anything? And he was reacting just sort of like, he thought I was maybe wrong, So then I said, no, this is serious. My colleague just, told me. I then read it. Someone translated it verbatim to him. And I said, can you respond to this? And he said, this is a total lie. And these are the lies that Israel uses to undermine Palestinian journalists and Palestinian people all the time. So, he said, Islamic Jihad wouldn't need to use anyone like that. We haven't used him. He has no relationship to Islamic Jihad, except the relationship you, Jeremy, have to Islamic Jihad, which is that you interview people from Islamic Jihad.
There's a lot to talk about, actually, but I think we want to just move on to Yemen for just a moment. And I wanted to ask Maz something about Murtaza, about one of his recent articles. And of course, all of this is related. Just actually, while we were speaking now, the Israeli military said that it has fully disabled, it bombed the airport in the capital of Yemen, in Sana'a, and has fully disabled the airport there. And it also struck several power plants. And this is coming as part of a larger campaign of the carpet bombing of Yemen. The Trump administration, the Biden administration was also bombing Yemen, but the Trump administration has scaled this up since March, especially bombing Yemen in an attempt to stop the Houthis from their military intervention on behalf of Palestinians in Gaza. The Houthis, of course, have attacked Israel-linked ships in the Red Sea and other ships and severely disrupted global maritime trade. They've also launched attacks against Israel, most recently hitting Ben Gurion Airport in Lid just on Sunday. But the U.S. has conducted strikes against more than 1,000 targets in Yemen, killing hundreds of civilians, and most recently hitting a detention facility in Saada in the north, housing African migrants that killed over 60 people. But Murtaza, your most recent piece on this examines how the Trump administration appears to be selecting targets, or the Pentagon is selecting targets that may be drawing on anonymous social media accounts to plan some of these deadly attacks. Can you explain some of this and what you found?
Sure. There was an attack in late April north of Sana'a against a target which had been previously identified by, as you mentioned, a number of anonymous social media accounts on Twitter or X as being a Houthi military site. So these attacks or these accounts in the past, they have informed U.S. targeting practices. And there's one particular account or two accounts we identified which had noted this particular point, which had been cited by West Point publications, very reputable military publications, as credible. And those points were struck. It turns out later on, upon investigation by local media, there had been no Houthi military presence there at all. There were several civilians, 8 civilians who were killed in these attacks. And one of the accounts we noted, they actually apologized for what it's worth for resulting in putting forward information which seemed to have been used later to kill these people. The account later gave a charitable donation and then deactivated itself. Obviously, it's a very pitiful sort of response given the magnitude of what took place. I think there's a broader context taking place here, which is that the Pentagon under Pete Hegseth has removed very, very forthrightly all the meager sort of regulations and protections which were put in place during the war on terror to sort of mitigate some of the worst excesses of that period, civilian protections, targeting protections. They were always very, very insufficient, but whatever is there has already been degraded even further under this administration. They don't have a lot of people delegated towards targeting or civilian casualty mitigation. So there's really low incentive for taking great steps to mitigate civilian casualties in Yemen or elsewhere the U.S. military is presently bombing. And there's not much punishment when these cases go wrong. And finally, because of the fact that the Houthis, they've been adapting their entire military force for over a decade to evade airstrikes and to be resilient against airstrikes, there's not a lot of obvious targets to hit. So they're relying on OSINT, as it's called, OSINT verification or identification of alleged targets. But even then, they're kind of giving up on that, and they're just hitting civilian targets now. So the Israelis are bombing the Hodeidah port, as you mentioned. They're bombing power plants, cement factories, saying we can't find the Houthis, we don't know where they are, or we don't have good intelligence about them. Let's just punish the entire population of Yemen and hope that something just breaks that way. And I think that this is, it's kind of trying to make the Gazification of the entire Middle East. So they're bombing Lebanon in that sense. They're thinking about bombing Iran in that way. They're bombing Syria in that way. They're just hitting the civilian population of these countries to make them suffer as much as possible in the hopes that maybe it'll generate some advantageous political outcome for Israel thereafter. So, I think that unfortunately, it goes back to what Jeremy was talking about with his conversations with Osama Hamdan and the historical contextualization of this conflict. The state ideology of Israel, you can call it the Zionism or the predominant form of Zionism, which now informs the government, it's predicated now for its survival. It needs to effectively commit genocide against all surrounding states. And so by bombing the port of Hodeidah, there's a very specific goal in mind to generate famine in Yemen, because that port is very, very important for food imports and aid imports to Yemen. It was a very important part of the war in Yemen and the control of it for that reason. Well, they're saying, well, if you can't, you don't like what we're doing in Gaza, maybe you can all starve. Millions of people in Yemen can starve, and that's fine. So I think that you can't divorce this from what's going on in Gaza in that sense. And the manner the campaign is being carried out in Yemen is very, very indicative of that same philosophy. And unfortunately, and I think this is the thing which makes it very, very important to us as Americans or people who live in the United States, people who pay taxes and are citizens here, the U.S. has become party to this genocidal sort of approach to the region. It's become helping facilitate it. So these strikes are being carried out not just by Israel, but by the U.S. in Yemen. And the goal is no really strategic, rational goal. No one really seems to even think this is going to stop the Houthis and military attacks and so forth. The Houthis have said to drop site and elsewhere that they would stop these attacks if the siege in Gaza ends. They're just trying to commit genocide against Yemenis now for the sake of upholding the genocide in Gaza. So that's kind of the trajectory where we're looped into. And I think that unfortunately, I don't foresee this getting better. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And I think that, it's hard to prognosticate, but I think that what started October 7th and was expanding is only still in its early phases.
And we just have time for one more question, Maz, but I wanted to ask you also, you're working on a piece about the supposed efficacy of this U.S. bombing campaign in reducing the Houthis' military capability. And, what are these targets that they're hitting? And is it really having any real effect, given the Houthis have, the Houthis fought 6 wars against Ali Abdullah Saleh and have a long experience in military combat and have basically places in the mountains where they hide and bury their weapons and keep them safe. So can you just give us kind of a sneak preview of what you're working on and what you found in your reporting?
So we've been interviewing Houthi officials as well as weapons experts and military experts based on to get their evaluation of the campaign against the Houthis. This will come out in the piece, but it's very, very important to notice that one of the probably the most important aspect of the U.S. and Israeli way of war in the Middle East is based on air superiority. So you could not carry out the genocide in Gaza without total air superiority, minimal air defenses, no air defenses in the case of Gaza. In the last few months, the U.S. has been losing a tremendous number of drones in Yemen, MQ-9 Reaper drones. They're very expensive drones that the U.S. has been using there. I think it was a 1-week period. They lost 3 of these drones. They only have about 230 in total in their entire fleet. They lost maybe 10% of those just fighting the Houthis right now. The drones are easier to shoot down than manned aircraft, but shows a gradual degradation of this very, very important pillar of U.S. warfare and by extension Israeli warfare in the Middle East, which is the ability to draw upon total air and surveillance capabilities. So when you're losing those drones, you start losing the ability to surveil Houthi leaders, find where they are, actually carry out attacks against them. That's why you've seen very, very few killings of senior Houthi leaders in this campaign. And by the U.S. fighting a weaker party, and the Houthis are weaker, in some way, it weakens the stronger party. It's kind of a perverse sort of impact of these kind of wars. The longer the Houthis survive, the stronger they get and the weaker their opponents get. They've been fighting for 20 years, and they've only become more and more, you could say, anti-fragile in the case of these attacks. And a very, very important thing that the U.S. is happening in the U.S. right now, too, in the war, is that they're deploying very advanced munitions, very advanced aircraft, and they're losing some of those, especially the munitions, and they're being captured by the Houthis, and they're being redesigned and reworked so that in a few years or even less than that, you see an Iranian version of a very advanced U.S. drone or a very, very advanced U.S. missile, which has been captured by the Houthis, given them to them, and then redeployed against the U.S. And, this could happen with Russia and China and so forth. So it's not just that the U.S. is failing to defeat the Houthis. It's actually resulting in a very severe degradation of everything that's important to U.S. policymakers say it's important to them. They're losing their competitive edge, their technological edge in this fight. So they're wasting their time, their ammunition, they're wasting their credibility, their moral authority, and all those things. But at a very practical level, there's a material loss to this. So, we're talking to the Houthis about this, talking to weapons experts about this as well, too. It's very, very damaging. So I think the people who want America to extricate itself from the Middle East for moral reasons, I think you can add to that as a very practical resource and strategic reasons why being involved in this genocide, facilitating this genocide, trying to expand it is weakening America in very, very serious ways. And it's proceeding with a 20-year period of the war on terror that's continued to harm, American standing and, freedoms and the standard of living. And by continuing to engage in it, it's only going to get worse. So if there's any faction in the U.S. administration which is aware of this, and I believe there are, they should take that into account. Hopefully that faction will win and the U.S. will extricate itself from this death pact that it's engaged with the Israeli leadership, which has become so unbelievably extreme that it's demanding things of America which are morally unconscionable, but also strategically suicidal in the long term.
Well, there's a lot more to talk about, but we're going to have to leave it there. I encourage everyone to look out for this upcoming article by Murtaza, and also definitely check out Jeremy's interview, where you can read or listen to his interview with senior Hamas official Osama Hamdan, and more reporting on his meetings coming up in the next few days. And that does it for this live stream. We're here Tuesdays at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. If you want to support our work, you can subscribe at dropsidenews.com. You can also make a 501c3 tax-deductible donation to our work by going to dropsidenews.com and clicking on Ways to Give. Make sure to follow us on social media platforms and let people know about our work. On behalf of everyone at Dropside, I'm Sharif Abdul Quddus. Thanks for joining us.